Merci. I would like, first of all, to thank the organizers for the invitation to deliver a presentation here. And I'd like to thank Jean-Michel, Louis Blondiot, Yves Saint-Thomé, Hilaria. And I would like to say that usually when you're the last one, it's difficult to say new things, but I think that what has been great about this event is that it has been very rich in new ideas, and I really learn a lot, so I really don't mind being the last one. I hope I can say something new for you too. My presentation will deal with two issues simultaneously. At one point, I even thought about delivering a presentation on the topic, is there a Latin American model of democracy? Because so many people speak about a Latin American model, a Brazilian model, a Porto Alegre model, and I happen to think that there is no such a thing as a Latin American, Brazilian, or Porto Alegre model. What we really have are democracies, and what is new is the fact that a country from the south, a new democracy, Brazil, is really contributing something to democratic theory. On the other hand, though there is a lot of participation, new forms of representation in Brazil, I also happen to think that most of the international literature has concentrated very much on only one characteristic of democracy in Brazil, mainly participation, or mainly participatory budgeting, participation in participatory budgeting, and though perhaps I'm guilty together with Yves and a few other guys about that, but I think it's time to decenter this whole debate on participatory budgeting, and this is what I will try to do in this presentation. So my point is there are new democracies in Latin America, there are new forms of representation and participation in Latin America, and they have introduced three new dimensions for democratic theory. One is constitution making, the second is the articulation between representation and participation, and the third is variation participatory designs. And in my view, the literature, particularly the international literature on participatory budgeting, and particularly the Anglo-Saxon literature on participatory budgeting, has really concentrated on the second point, or on one part of the second point, participation, yeah? And I think that this is a mistake, that it's time for us to move beyond that, and I'll try to show that constitution making and variation designs are at least as important as participation. So my first point is that, and my first point is there is a missing point in most of the debates on participation, that is very few people really understand that the first important point in Latin American democracies after democratization during the 80s is that Latin America inaugurated a new tradition of constitution making. Yeah, very few people make this point. As a matter of fact, today we are speaking, and I am organizing a project called the New Constitutionalism in Latin America, but few people really see that. Yeah, so I would say that countries such as Brazil, but also Peru, Bolivia, Ecuador, Venezuela is something else. I'm not going to talk about Venezuela here. Inaugurated the tradition of democratization with constitution making. But it's not just constitution making. I think that's more than that, because there is a very consolidated view in the West, and I would say in this case, both in Europe and in the United States, about what constitution making is about. And constitution making in Europe and the United States is, constitution is a short document that you don't change. Yeah, these are endurable constitutions. Yeah, the most successful is United States, because United States really never changed this constitution, and this is, let's say, the token of success or the sign of success. And my view here is really different. Latin Americans inaugurated something different, which I think is long documents, long revisable documents. Yeah, and why is it that we think about long revisable documents? For two reasons: because constitutions should involve not only polity, our constitution, the Brazilian, but also the Ecuadorian, the Bolivian. Our constitution is about polity and policy. Yeah, so we have these two dimensions in constitution making. But we also, since we involve, our constitutions involve policy, they are also revisable documents. So this is the first point that I would like to make here, that I think has been broadly missed by the literature. My second point is, and here really concentrating on Brazil, but I could make similar points also for other countries in Latin America. My second point is participation in Brazil would have been impossible without the changes that the Constitution has introduced in regard to participation. The Brazilian Constitution speaks or refers to participation in 14 different articles or chapters, beginning on chapter 1 that says that the people is sovereign and can express its sovereignty directly or through its representative institutions. And very few people really paid attention to the fact that once participatory budgeting started in Porto Alegre, there were legal challenges. And what the court said, well, Article 1 allows participatory budgeting. And if this has not been there, I really have my doubts whether participatory budgeting would have succeeded, because some of the legal challenges were really tough by important political actors, much more important than the Workers' Party at that point. Yeah? So both Article 1 and 14 are key in the case of Brazil for the existence of participation. The second point is that both Article 1 and other articles of the Brazilian Constitution, they establish the mix between representation and participation. And they establish a mix in a way that has not been truly understood, I would say, by most international scholars who work on participatory budgeting. I have read, and there are plenty of works on participatory budgeting, but I have read many works that think that the only dimension of participatory budgeting is really participation in the direct mode, yeah? But that's not true, yeah? Participatory budgeting is participation, it's open entry at the local level, plus a council that's constituted through the participatory process, plus the integration of this process with representative institutions. And this point has been broadly downplayed by most of the people who have worked with participation. And right now we are seeing in Brazil, and I'm not going to elaborate a lot on that, but I've been working on that. Lula's government introduced a new form of participation called national conferences. And again, what we're seeing is that national conferences are civil society meetings that take place in Brasilia after a process of debates in cities and at the state level. Around 5 million people have participated in these conferences. But what is interesting is the most important result of this national conferences during Lula's government is that they generated new legislation for the National Congress on important topics for civil society. 7% of all the legislation that exists today in the Brazilian National Congress is the result of proposals made in the National Conference. So I think that the problem is not really to dissociate participation and representation, but the issue that the Brazilian process has been posing to democratic theories, how to associate more closely participation and representation. And this is perhaps the problem that we still do not have. Yeah, it would be good. Yeah. We still do not have a clear answer to it. When it comes to the forms of participation, I would say that we have three forms of participation in Brazil today, or we have three forms of participation in democratic Brazil. One I call, and I think it's important to differentiate these forms, one I call bottom-up, one I call power sharing, and the third one I call the ratification design. 95% literature is on bottom-up participation. Participatory budgeting is bottom-up, and bottom-up has four characteristics that are very well known. I'm not going to elaborate a lot on that. One is open entry at the grassroots level. The second is low involvement of the government in the decision-making process. The third one is formation of all civil society bodies. Generally, the government is not part of these bodies. And the fourth is they are effective only in situations of deep agreement between civil society and political actors on the introduction of participation. And here again we come to the issue of Porto Alegre and Porto Alegre model. Is Porto Alegre model? Yes and no. Yeah? In which sense is Porto Alegre model? Porto Alegre is a model in the sense that it shows that something different can take place. Is Porto Alegre a model that can be emulated in Brazil or outside Brazil? No. Yeah? And this, I think, is a point that has been broadly missed by the literature. Why we can't emulate, or why Porto Alegre is not the general case of participation, this is one point that I would like to elaborate in my talk. And I would say because this broad consensus about political parties, even political parties in the opposition, and the main opposition party in Porto Alegre when participatory budgeting started was the PDT, that was also a party in favor of participation. So one of the important characteristics of participatory budgeting in Porto Alegre was precisely the fact that broad sectors of political society agreed with participation, and these broad sectors, they had majority in the public administration, but also in the city council, yes? But if we look to most of the other cases in Brazil, we don't see this broad consensus. Second, there was a broad consensus on between civil society actors and these political actors that participation should be pursued. And there is a reason why there was this broad consensus. And again, this broad consensus is really part of what Porto Alegre politics was about during the 80s and the 90s. Yeah? Most neighborhood associations that would take place in participatory budgeting, they were formed at the same time of the Workers' Party grassroots militants. They would transit very openly in between their neighborhood associations and the political party. So there was a broad agreement on participation. The first person in charge of participatory budgeting, Iria Charão, she was, as a matter of fact, the president also, she has been the president of the Association of Neighborhood, of the Umbrella Association of Neighborhood Communities, WAMPA, before being in charge of participatory budgeting. So my point here is when we speak about participatory budgeting, or when we speak about bottom-up design, we need to see what are the cases that most likely we face and what is Porto Alegre, and in which case or in which dimension of the Porto Alegre case is the exemplary dimension. The second design that I would like to call attention to you, because it's very broad in Brazil, it exists and it's very important, I call it power sharing. And I also think that power sharing design has four characteristics. One is they are less participatory, they already involve more of a civil society representation, they do not allow for, they are not open entry, though there are conferences at the local level in the areas of health, social assistance. But when we speak about councils, civil society is represented. In these councils, they are not open entry. But what is important is they are more deliberative than participatory budgeting, and they are more deliberative in one sense. Civil society and state actors, they are together in those power-sharing designs. These power-sharing designs are the most well-known are councils, and in these councils are split. Half of its members are civil society members, half are state members. And the fourth issue is that they are legally institutionalized. The origins of these councils is the 1988 Constitution in Brazil, and the 1988 Constitution in Brazil, in all chapters on policy making, it envisioned bodies that would be shared by civil society and state actors, and then there are sanctions for not carrying out these councils. All these councils involve local legislation, but they also involve, these policies also involve transferences from the federal government to the cities, and this transference can be suspended in the case in which participation is not introduced or it's not carried out, and we have a few cases. Let me just explain briefly.
You have 10 minutes left.
So let me just explain briefly the third design. And third design is the one that we know mostly in Brazil, but also in many other Latin American countries. I call it a ratification design. And ratification design is the state has the prerogative of proposing a policy, but it has to approve this policy at civil society level. And then there are assemblies or public audiences, as we call them in Brazil. And in these public audiences, the state has to approve its policy. It's widely disseminated in Brazil in the area of urban planning. So every Brazilian city with more than 2,000 people is required to approve a city master plan in these assemblies, and it has to be more than one assembly. I'm going to talk about that. And this is also a third way of democratizing urban policy and local policy making in Brazil. So what I have done, and some parts of my presentation are part of my last book that I published in 2009. What I have tried to compare is how these institutions, how they work in different cities. Let's say that Porto Alegre is a model. Yeah, Porto Alegre is a model because participatory budgeting works very well, because the Workers' Party ran the city for 16 years, because also the other policies such as councils and city master plan work very well in Porto Alegre. But if we look to more contentious city, or if we look into more complicated cases, what happens to the three designs? Yeah, and that's why I wanted to compare São Paulo, Belo Horizonte, and Porto Alegre to see how these different designs they would eventually work in each one of the cities, and then how what we are able to say about these different designs. And São Paulo is a very interesting case, both about the Workers' Party, civil society organization, and participatory policies. It's the most difficult case in Brazil. It's one of the cities that during the Brazilian democratization started civil society organization. We can say that the Workers' Party was born in São Paulo, that some of its first participatory policies emerged in the city. São Paulo is also a city that the Catholic Church influenced grassroots participation in the city because it had a very progressive bishop during the 70s until 1984. So São Paulo has all the important characteristics that a participatory policy requires, but still it has problems in carrying out participatory policies. Why? Mainly for three reasons. Yeah, and these three reasons, perhaps we can learn a little bit more about participation if we think about these reasons. One, civil society is very unevenly organized in the city of São Paulo for many reasons. One of them, because the Pope divided the archdiocese in 1984, because he thought that there was too much progressive policy there. So he left parts of the archdiocese with left-wing groups, but nominated conservative bishops, divided in four, nominated three other conservative bishops, and with that he disassembled part of the grassroots organization in the city. Yeah, so this is important. So the east and the west zones of São Paulo are civil society are very well organized, but in the southern zones of São Paulo, something very interesting took place. The Pope nominated a very conservative bishop, but those who thrived were the new Pentecostals, or the evangelics, as we say in Brazil, and they are not very much in favor of participation. They have a different conception about grassroots participation. This is first difficulty for civil society organization in São Paulo. The second is the Workers' Party does well in the city, but it has only, its ceiling is 33-35% of the votes. It always needs to compose. This differentiates Workers' Party in Porto Alegre and Belo Horizonte from the Workers' Party in São Paulo. And when it composes, it nominates conservative politicians, and these conservative politicians, they run public policies at the local level. So this is the picture of São Paulo, and this picture shows why participatory budgeting has problems in being implemented in São Paulo. It does not work in the southern zone because there is not enough grassroots organization. Some of the regional administrators nominated by the Workers' Party, those who belong to the Workers' Party organize participatory budgeting, but those who don't belong, they don't organize, they organize something else, and then you cannot run the city with this kind of participatory policy because the city is too much contentious for that. So my point, and this is why I carried out these other studies, was to compare with health councils and compare with city master plan. And what we see is that the legal dimension is very important. Yeah, exactly what lacks in participatory budgeting, that is the legal dimension, is what both city master plans and health councils add to the São Paulo equation. And what we see is that they are more feasible policies that are more successful in São Paulo than participatory budgeting that works in a few regions and does not work in other regions. 7 minutes, yeah. So, could go on and compare with other cities. Salvador is a very interesting case as well, exactly for city master plans. And again, we see the same dimension. As long as participation is legalized and we have the help of the judicial system to implement it, and a weak civil society can cope with sanctions against the state in order to implement participation, we see participation as being effective. As long as we see just political will in operation, as it is the case with participatory budgeting, we see that there are problems for the implementation of participatory budgeting in Salvador, as we see problems in other cities as well. So my point here is which case should be the average, or how should we cope with participation given this kind of variation in design, variation in results. And my point is, it's more likely that we'll face cases like São Paulo that will face cases like Porto Alegre. Porto Alegre is very important as a model, but Porto Alegre it's good for a successful model, but the difficulties that would emerge in participatory policies have not been faced by Porto Alegre for very specific characteristics. And I could add Belo Horizonte. Belo Horizonte is a case that is also very similar to Porto Alegre. Broad consensus on the Workers' Party on participation, a civil society that was not as strong, but still was strong enough to force the administration to carry out participatory policies. But once we leave these very successful cases, the cases that we find are more mixed. And my point here is, if we really want to expand participation, we need to know the characteristics of the difficult cases, yeah? And the characteristics of the difficult cases are that that legal infrastructure for participation needs to be in place in order for participation to be carried out. So just going to conclude here with 3 points. I think that it's the time that we should reconsider participation in Brazil and try to decentrate it just from the bottom-up forms of participation, even because most of the places where I see participatory budgeting reproduced, participatory budgeting is reproduced more as a public audience or as a power-sharing design than as a bottom-up design. I'm not going to talk about participation in Europe in front of Yves Saint-Omer, but my feeling is that participatory budgeting in Europe is less bottom-up and much more a power-sharing or ratification design than a bottom-up design, because it cannot really mobilize broadly at the grassroots level in all regions to become a citywide policy. So I think it's good to decentralize, if we decentrate from the bottom-up design, because we'll be able to see more the cases in different lines, and we'll see that the variation is important to understand the other cases. Second is we need to cope with the issue that participation is contentious. Yeah, if we take out a few cities in Brazil or in Latin America, but even in many Brazilian cities, what we'll see is that participation is contentious. There are people in favor of participation, but there are also people against participation. And if we just cope with a design that has in mind very consensual aspects of participation, we're going to have problems in broadening participation in a more general way. So it's interesting to see these cases, and it's also interesting to see that the contentious cases are the ones in which participation has the most effect on the representative system. Because if you come to Porto Alegre and you see the Workers' Party with a majority in the city council, and every city councilor will say, well, just give me here the budget and I'm going to approve it, this is one issue. But the second, much more difficult issue is when you come to a city council such as São Paulo or such as Salvador or Belém, and you have city councilors that they don't want to carry out the policy, yeah? And here is where you need to cope with the issue that participation, a well-designed process of participation needs to change the representative system. And in order to change the representative system, it needs to have some sanction elements upon the political system. And my last point is constitution making is a key variable, and I think that has been broadly overlooked in Europe, and I don't think that that forms of participation that are strong and could influence the political system could be carried out without legal changes, yeah? So I think that because we concentrated very much on the bottom-up model, perhaps that's the reason why we miss the constitution making element. But constitution making element is there in Brazil, and it's not there in many other places. And I think that changing constitutions and understand that constitutions need to respond to the problems of the age and not the problems of a group of aristocratic slave owner founding fathers. If constitution making is really going to answer to the problems of the age, constitutions need to be changed in order for participation to be carried out. So these are my points.
Thank you.